Pontiac City Council is hereby called to order. It's 4:00 p.m. on May 19th, 2022. Pledge of Allegiance. Let's stand.
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Roll call, Clerk Doyle.
Carrington,
Present.
Goodman,
Present.
James, McGinnis,
Present.
Nicholson,
Here.
Parker, Rutherford. Mr. President, you have a quorum.
Quorum being established, is there a motion to authorize the excusing of Councilman Parker and Councilwoman Rutherford for personal reasons?
So moved.
Support.
Moved by Nicholson, seconded by Goodman. We anticipate both of our colleagues to be joining us as soon as they're able today, but they were missing the first section, so we are, as our rules call for, excusing them for at least a portion of the meeting. Roll call. Hearing no discussion, roll call on the authorization to excuse council members Parker and Rutherford from the meeting for personal reasons. Clerk Doyle.
Goodman,
Yes.
James. Yes. McGinnis,
Yes.
Nicholson,
Yes.
Carrington.
Yes.
5 yeas, no nays.
All right, is there a motion to, thank you very much, that motion carries. Is there a motion to approve today's meeting agenda as presented?
So moved. Support.
Moved by Goodman, seconded by Carrington. That motion is before us. Should we amend this to add a number 4, the executive's office budget, if there is time?
I'll make the amendment.
Support.
Okay, so we're adding a number 4 on the executive's office budget. Yesterday, recreation consumed the time that we had, as well as broader budget conversations, and so we may not get to it today either. But if time allows, rather than having to shift it at the 11th hour, we have it on our radar now while we're doing the agenda business. Any further discussion on the motion to amend? Yes, ma'am.
I don't have that with me, so I would need, if we do get to the executive session, I would need a copy of it.
Okay, sounds good.
I will actually go secure that right now, and I will be right back.
Okay. Well, it might just be, we might not even get to it, but, so we'll gauge that, but you're not alone in that position, so thank you for flagging that. Any further discussion on the motion to amend? Hearing no further discussion, roll call on adoption of the amendment, adding that 4th department hearing for the executive's office. Clerk Doyle.
James,
Yes.
McGinnis,
Yes.
Nicholson,
Yes.
Carrington,
Yes.
Goodman.
Yes.
5 yeas, no nays.
That motion carries. Are there any other changes, questions, corrections, amendments? Hearing none, roll call on adoption of the agenda as amended. Clerk Doyle.
James,
Yes.
McGinnis,
Yes.
Nicholson,
Yes.
Carrington,
Yes.
Goodman.
Yes.
5 yeas, no nays.
That motion carries. We are now at item number 1, the fire services for the city of Pontiac. Our contracted entity is Waterford Regional Fire Department. And so we are at the budget review for that particular report. I want to give the floor to Mayor and Administration for the preface.
Yes. So I would just ask if we could actually do the sheriff's office first, as we have a sheriff's deputy with us now. Would that be okay?
Any objection from colleagues?
None.
Hearing no objection, Clerk Doyle, do we need to do any sort of vote with it? All right, without objection, yes, we are now at, for police services, we contract with the Oakland County Sheriff's Department for the delivery of those services. Deputy Mayor Stevens, you have the floor.
All right. Thank you very much, Council. this should actually be a nice, direct, easy opportunity for us. So I think we're all aware that a number of years ago, the city of Pontiac contracted with the Oakland County Sheriff to provide policing services to the community. We are continuing in that contract, and so this budget reflects that. Highlights that you will see in here are that we have the actual cost of the contract, but then beneath the actual cost of the contract, you see an additional line for overtime services. And so those overtime services are actually, yes, you have times when deputies have regularly scheduled overtime, but you also have special events that are held in the city, and so that line item covers that. A lot of those special events end up being offset in cost, but there is actual overtime costs above and beyond the contract, and so you see that there. And then additionally, at the very, very top, you see a line for salaries and wages. That is a little bit misleading. We do not actually have a body at the sheriff's office that we are paying for. We provide services to that building, maintenance services, and we back charge against this line item for those services. And so that's where that salary and wage line is. Other than that, I think this is a very standard, straightforward budget, and we are open for whatever questions you may have on it.
Thank you. And since we do have a representative from the Sheriff's Department, if you'd like to introduce yourself, sir, and any top-level items you'd like to flag for us before we get into dialogue and questions.
Lieutenant Eric Hicks, side of the Pontiac substation. I have nothing to bring forward to you.
How long have you been with the Pontiac substation?
I've been with Oakland County for 22 years. I've actually physically been assigned to Pontiac. Was on our fugitive team, assigned as my area of responsibility was Pontiac, but physically assigned a patrol as a sergeant capacity, lieutenant capacity, about 8 years now.
Thank you. Mayor and Deputy Mayor, where are we presently in terms of the cycle of the contract? And I anticipate that the change that you see for professional services, Oakland County Sheriff, in terms of this current fiscal year versus what is forecast for the year to come, comes with changes negotiated through that contract process, and you're only seeing a portion of that impact through half of this current fiscal year. But would you like to expound on that?
My understanding is that it's a 3-year contract, that it was approved in December of last year, December of 2021. And so that gives you a sense of when it will expire in roughly around December of 2024. In terms of the increase in cost, that's because there are some cost escalators, I'll call them, that are in the contract. Those cost escalators are also in every other sheriff's contract that is between the Sheriff's Department and other Oakland County communities. And I can certainly allow the sheriff's deputy to get into more details about some of those. I think there's a provision. I think there's a wage or salary increase component there, but there's also, I believe, a body camera cost sharing arrangement that may be built in as well. And then there is a third aspect, which has to do with phasing in over time a greater cost sharing for administrative costs. The Sheriff's Department pushed back quite vigorously on the County Executive's Office, which is the entity that pushed for some of those administrative cost sharing elements. And so it was reduced below what the County Executive initially pushed for. But there still is some administrative cost sharing element. I have had some conversations with some county commissioners about possibly providing for a rebate for some of these costs that are new to the sheriff's contract this year, a rebate for economically distressed communities, which would obviously benefit, depending on how that's defined, Pontiac. So I can keep you posted about those discussions around a rebate, but as the contract itself is designed, I think I've accurately described it. Deputy, did I get some details wrong there, or do you have any additional details to share?
No, sir, I don't. It sounds right on.
Or Deputy Mayor, or
No, that-
Mr. Carrington, for that matter?
That sounded correct.
But so the expanded presence and deputies in the Pontiac community, that's a driving force as well, that we have additional community policing and traffic enforcement.
That's true, because the new contract came into existence in the middle of this fiscal year. Only some of those costs were accounted for in the current fiscal year, whereas for about half the fiscal year, whereas for the entirety of next fiscal year, those costs of the additional deputies will come into force. So that's absolutely right. And some of what I've described won't even fully be realized in the coming fiscal year, but rather in later years of the contract. But I know that Councilwoman James expressed the desire to look a little bit further out in the future than just the coming fiscal year, which is why I wanted to fully disclose that sheriff's contract does have some further cost escalators that won't be realized until years 2 and 3 of that contract.
Thank you. I'd like to recognize Councilman Parker as present and voting at 4:10 p.m. Pro Tem Carrington, then Councilman Nicholson.
Yeah, thank you, President McGinnis. I guess just kind of briefly explain, you got the two new line items that were not included in the 2021-2022 budget concerning salaries and wages. So why was that added to this particular budget? And how was it paid for previously?
I will defer to Director Carrington for that answer.
Good afternoon. Councilman Carrington and to the council, for this year, we're trying to better track some of these cost allocations. If you notice that there is a ledger account on there for, I believe it's maintenance wages that was listed for the current fiscal year.
Okay.
There's a maintenance wages and maintenance overtime, and we're trying to track it. Part of what we're trying to do is to be able to track it on an automatic basis right out of our payroll system, and so that we put in a fixed percentage. Because of the way that we're set up, that's going to go right into the salary and wages category. So that's kind of the rationale behind us essentially renaming the allocation accounts. Again, previously they had been under this maintenance wages, maintenance overtime, in an attempt for us to try and set it up within Paylocity. All of our Paylocity accounts track back to the salary and wages, so we're limited in what we can allocate in. So that's kind of the rationale for how it was.
Okay, and my follow-up question, what was your rationale in between doubling that? That line item.
So we basically went off of the guidance from DPW in terms of the workers that they have, particularly the workers that they're proposing to add, and we allow them to set the breakdown and cost allocation numbers. So these are just estimates based on what they kind of project in terms of time spent and the workers spent on various accounts and departments.
If I could tag team on that question, can you expound on some of the public, Department of Public Works services that are provided for the sheriff's substation? Obviously, janitorial services is one.
The maintenance, our maintenance guys, and for police, we do, and for the sheriff, we do the grass cutting and snow removal as well. So time that the DPW team members spend on that would be reflected in those costs there.
And I guess I'm a little concerned about it doubling. Basically, when you still have a line item snow removal at $10,000.
And I think there's a couple of things. One is we're adding a much larger number of workers to the DPW team under the proposed budget, and I think we probably have not been tracking these costs to the extent that we could have. So it's not so much us really incurring twice the cost. I think it's more of a function of us doing a better job of trying to track this, or attempting to do a better job of tracking it and allocating it in a more accurate manner.
Okay. And can I have one more question?
Sure, you have the floor.
Concerning the overtime wages, I know the deputy mayor mentioned something. So in past, haven't those special events organizers actually paid for these services?
So for special events, for sure, those costs are reimbursed on a dollar for dollar basis. The sheriff contracts with the event organizer, and we get those costs reimbursed on a dollar for dollar basis. But there are other instances of regular patrol and regular deputies that are serving, in terms of the under the overall contract, where overtime is incurred.
So wouldn't that, and this is a question for Mayor Grimal, so within that overall contract, they don't estimate any kind of overtime within that contract?
Apparently not, is my understanding, and we can certainly inquire with the Sheriff's Department about that. And you're raising a good point, which is, I think, twofold. One is, why don't they take into account overtime? And I think the answer to that is basically that the contracts are designed so that it's just based around 40-hour weeks. But the second, I think, even more important question is, well, why so much overtime? And are there things that can be done to reduce that overtime? For example, if we were to contract for, another few deputies, could we actually save money, because maybe that would reduce the needed overtime if we just had more deputies, and maybe it would be cheaper to have more deputies. I don't know if that's necessarily the case, because of course with additional deputies you're paying for more benefits, and so that can get a little complicated. But depending on the overtime rate, they get paid not just the regular flat wage for overtime, but I think they get some escalation, time and a half, or maybe even more than that, depending on the situation, and the deputy might be able to shed some light on that. So you are raising a good question, which is, if in fact we have more needs in terms of hours of deputies on the road, might it be less expensive to actually just contract for more deputies? And that's the right question to ask, and I don't know the answer.
Okay. Thank you.
And I can actually add to that just a little bit. So when officers are in court, you can never know how long an officer is going to be in court, but that is not straight time. That's an overtime charge. So.
All right. Thank you. No more questions, President. Again.
Mayor Grimal, you have a
Well, I think the deputy mayor is right about that, but I guess I would say, and I don't know enough about the collective bargaining agreement that the Sheriff's Department and Deputy Association have agreed to, and so some of this might be things that aren't really in the discretion of the Sheriff's Department, depending on what the contract says. But I do wonder aloud, okay, granted, they don't know how long they're going to be in court, but if they've racked up a certain amount of time in court a week, at least in theory, you could then have reduced their hours on road patrol as that becomes apparent, and maybe have another deputy on road patrol. But, that gets complicated too, because, you could do that so long as you think you'll have adequate road patrol coverage without that deputy who's maybe spent more time in court that week than anticipated, without that deputy being on the road. But again, that's why if you contracted for more deputies, you could presumably have that cushion, so you could reduce deputy time on the road as needed if they were running late in court, potentially. So some of this comes down to the collective bargaining agreement, some of it comes down to the actual practicalities and costs involved, and some of it may come down just to the administrative preferences of the Sheriff's Department in terms of ease of administration. They might say, well, we schedule somebody for 40 hours based on these assumptions, and if we start, if they spend more time in court or spend more time on the road on a given day based on the fact that they were at the scene of an accident when their shift normally expires and they had to attend to things on scene and obviously therefore worked longer than they were scheduled for on that shift, maybe it's just administratively unwieldy to then later that same week try to reduce the number of hours they're working. So I can imagine a variety of reasons why, although in theory you could maybe accommodate it as I've described, it might not be actually possible or practical to do it in actuality.
Councilman Nicholson.
To build on that, Lieutenant Hicks, I have a question for you. I imagine
Hicks, H-I-C-K-S?
HIX.
H-I-X, all right. Thank you, sir.
I imagine, I recall from previous council's conversation about we can add a number of officers, but if the sheriff's department doesn't have the staffing or the resources to put to it, there may be a really long wait before additional officers. You don't have. I remember during COVID too that the academies weren't necessarily running, so I imagine there's probably a very probably not normal pause in staffing or just as any industry has right now. I can't imagine 900,000 in relation to a $14 million contract. To me, working in personnel seems like you are building in that need, and when we didn't anticipate in past budgets such an overtime, we're going to see that it is a historically high number, but we just came out of a historically difficult time in staffing. Does the sheriff's department have trickiness or difficulty in staffing currently?
Yeah, like everybody, but we're having a hard time with getting new employees and trained up, and training takes time.
Yeah. So I think that could also add to that piece. Administration, I'm curious about the rationale behind continuing to budget for the same numbers as last year as it relates to utilities, yet we've got about half of that projected activity for this fiscal year. A good example of that would be water and sewers at 22,000, and we're set to realize about 11,000.
So that is primarily a timing difference, but these are all. I believe that they are on the same contract as the rest of the city, and these are all chargebacks to pay for the overall city utilities. Is that correct? Okay. Yeah. So some are billed directly to the individual building account. So it is both a timing issue and an issue of being part of the chargebacks that you heard us talk about before.
I would agree, except for the exact same number down to the dollar as last year. So it looks like we're just pulling last year's number from last year into this year. I don't know that there's if there was a calculation that just gave us the same number as last year, yet we're realizing half of that. I mean, it's tricky. We're talking about tens of thousands in $1 million contract.
We will we will double check the actual bills, but there is no reason to believe that the cost should be different. But I will double check those bills for you.
Okay, well, my reason to believe the cost should be different is the projected activity. So either the projected activity is wrong, or the rationale behind why we're taking last year's number and plugging it into this year seems flawed. It's just an observation.
Yes. No. Great observation.
Thank you.
Legislative Counsel Sharp, and then Councilman Parker.
I just wanted to respond to what the mayor said. He was absolutely correct when he indicated about all these different variables with the contract. With the last council, there was a discussion about trying to reduce the overtime and trying to get additional bodies. But because of collective bargaining, that was an issue. In terms of going to court, the attempt was to just have potentially one deputy to go and to reduce costs that way. Therefore, you don't take officers off the street. So all of those issues had been discussed. Thank you.
Councilman Parker.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Brother President. Couple of questions. So, based on your contract, how many FTEs does this encompass in this number? How many employees are encompassed in this number?
I can't hear you, sir. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. How many employees are encompassed in this number?
Encompassed in that number?
Yeah, I mean,
I'm not sure of the exact breakdown, sir.
Yeah, so I would have to get the contract for you, get the exact number. I will
Okay.
do that.
And, well, you might as well go, let me finish.
Yes, please.
I'm not done. And is in this contract that you include benefit relief?
When you say benefit relief,
Well, I mean, if you have a deputy is on vacation, is you gonna fill that with some other deputy?
yes,
Is that included in this number?
I believe that is included in the number, but I will get the contract for you because there is a manning level that we're talking about. Yes.
Right, and so I need to make sure that that's there. And then my other question was, if you're short now, how are we accounting for, how do we know we're getting the bang for our buck?
As far as personnel goes, we're short. We maintain a minimum level staffing at all times. So the bang for the buck is you're getting that. It just depends on whether it's a full-time deputy or we're having to fill it by overtime.
Which is still a charge to us, correct?
Not necessarily. It depends on how or why we're filling that position, whether it's if somebody's on workman's compensation or something like that. Just depends on why we are short as far as where it gets billed. It doesn't necessarily just get billed to Pontiac for that.
So can you give me an example of when we would not be charged?
Well, for example, if somebody was on workman's comp, we've got a couple guys on workman's comp that were injured on the job. That gets paid. That gets picked up by our headquarters, and so it doesn't come out of Pontiac's account for that. As far as overtime, that would be one example, and then any other type of military leave or anything like that.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir.
Council President,
Yes,
if I may, Lieutenant Hicks does have another engagement that he needs to get to tonight. So if there are any other specific questions for the lieutenant, if we could ask them now, please.
Councilman, you question now, or you want to wait temporarily?
It's not for him, though.
Others for Lieutenant Hicks? My question is, would it be appropriate or available for council members in smaller groups, because we don't want to post it as a full meeting, but for those that are interested, I, in all honesty, have not been in the sheriff's substation beyond the main hallway. You know, when I've come in and I've reported something in a desk.
Sure.
So I'm not familiar what the current sort of status is of the conditions of the facilities with my own eyes. And so if there is time, if you want it, you don't have to commit right from on the spot, or if you'd like to enlist another of your colleagues at the substation, I know that it would be beneficial to me to get a sense of, it is a building that is quite aged, and fun fact, that upper level used to be our municipal court. Before there was a district courthouse in downtown Pontiac, it was all shoved into that building.
Okay.
But I know that there are various different maintenance and facilities matters that I'll ask that won't hold you up. I just want to put that on your radar that I don't know if any other colleagues might be interested in that, but it would be helpful for me to know when we're making some budgetary decisions about the facilities to see where they're at.
No, absolutely. I work day shift. I'm there Monday through Friday. I'd be more than happy. Anybody who wants to.
Okay. Other questions for Lieutenant Hicks on behalf of the Oakland County Sheriff's Department? Thank you very much for your time. We'll continue with the speakers list, reviewing the budget. Councilwoman James.
Yes, the question I have is the 3-year contract. Did that contract include an increase in officers over the course of 3 years? The mayor has already told us that there are some increases that are built into that, some sharing cost and some administrative costs. But specifically, did it include any increase in officers from year to year? Do you know the answer to that, Attorney Sharp?
The mayor can chime in on this. I don't believe that it was year to year, but there were additional officers that were included in the last contract.
So I agree with that. So I guess it depends what your question is getting at. It did add, I think, 3 road patrol deputies, as well perhaps as some investigators. And that went into effect this current first year.
Right.
And they will continue for years 2 and 3.
Right.
But there won't be any additional deputies in years 2 or 3 beyond this year's.
That was my question.
Okay.
Yeah, that was my question. Would there be any additional? And then the overtime, you know, looking at the whole budget, the only thing that really is an outlier is the 2021-22. Is that the overtime? The 547, and the number for 2022-23 is 900,000. Now that appears to be what the department requested. So my question is, what's in that request? What's going on there with that number almost doubling? And I think the mayor alluded to part of it, that there's some cost there for body camera. Is that all of why that is doubling?
Well, no, not in the overtime budget. So if you look at the overtime budget, as you said, you had the 547 as the budget at the beginning of the fiscal year.
Yeah.
You have the 911 is the actual recognized activity through January, March, April. You have just over $1 million is the projected activity to the end of this year. And so the 900,000 is the idea of, you know, we know it's going to be more than that 547, and we're hoping that we can work together with the sheriff's office to control it and hold it down to a number lower than the projected 1 million.
So the short answer is it was increased so substantially from what it was budgeted for the current year based on the actual experience, the actual expenditures this current year.
But does every year, does it explode like that?
Well, that was going to be my question, because what was it like in the previous year, which is to say the 2020-2021 year?
Councilman?
Another question. Who actually, who's the person that interacts with the sheriff's office on a regular basis? Is there a administrator that has a direct connection that kind of, I won't say manages, but is like the point of contact for the Oakland County Sheriff's Office?
The short answer is no, beyond me and the deputy mayor, beyond the deputy mayor and me. So when the sheriff's office needs to connect with us, they reach out to either the deputy mayor or me. Now, you know, one of the reasons why we asked for Deputy Gil Garrett to be housed at City Hall was so that City Council and the mayor could have more regular interaction with the sheriff's office. He still is employed by the sheriff's office. That's still his job. He does community policing for them. And, you know, in terms of his office being here rather than, say, at the substation next door, we thought that might better facilitate communication, not just with the mayor's office, but with City Council, with Deputy Garrett. But in terms of who does Captain Ewing approach or who does Deputy Garrett approach or any number of other people, it's really the deputy mayor or me is who they reach out to.
Okay.
A follow-up question to that is overtime payment requests, does that get a spot check from somebody internally at Pontiac City Hall?
I missed that. I was having a sidebar conversation with the councilman here, so forgive me.
It was about is it just a straight up, they submit what the overtime, you know, costs are or chargebacks are, and then it's processed by the finance staff member in the finance department, or is
there some review?
review?
That's a good question. I can tell you that I do not review those, and so it's a good question, Mr. President, in terms of how that is reviewed or determined to be legitimate. And so I'll defer to Director Carrington.
So we receive a monthly bill that gives a detailed breakdown of the cost, including the overtime, because there's some other related costs that go into the contract, and so those are received by the finance department, our accounts payable manager. We have a contact with the sheriff's office in their fiscal area, and so any questions that we have about the bill and the charges, we're able to follow up with them and get any additional detail. But generally, we receive these monthly bills that provide a detailed account of what is being billed, as well as detailed support for the charges in any monthly bill.
Yeah, and I can imagine that it's difficult, almost impossible, and this gets back to Pastor Councilman Parker's point, to verify the veracity of those charges, because it's really impossible for us to know whether such and such deputy worked such and such overtime on such and such a date. And so, to your point, Pastor Councilman, earlier about how do we know if we're getting the bang for our buck, it's really sort of impossible to know, frankly. And that's true not just with overtime, but also in terms of the committed minimum level of deputies on the street. It's really impossible for us to know that too, frankly. And so it is a challenge for sure. And I know I think we've got a legal section coming up a little later, but I'll just share that when it comes to legal bills, I personally go through all of the legal bills. And why do I personally go through all the legal bills? It's not exactly the most efficient or ideal use of my time, and it's certainly no fun for me. But I do it because we don't have another attorney here who is familiar with the wide range of issues that come up legally to really be able to meaningfully review those bills. And so I do it myself. If we had an in-house attorney who was salaried, we would have that person review these bills. But there's really nobody else here at City Hall who's well situated to go through those legal bills other than me. And I can tell you, and Tamura, as my assistant, can tell you that it's no fun, and she often has to get after me to do it.
It has resulted, not to deviate from the budget we're reviewing, but it has resulted in a cost savings for Pontiac taxpayers that you've done it.
Well, it has. I found some accidental misbillings to us when it should have gone to other clients, for example. But also just making sure that I think just they're knowing that I'm going over this and calling into question whether such and such number of hours had to be spent and whether this made sense. We have seen a pretty meaningful reduction in utilization of attorneys' time as well, which is important. So yes, but yes, we're way off topic now with the Sheriff's Department.
But it draws attention to how that there may be a future need for strengthening that review or contemplation about how that's processed.
Yeah, well, and that's why I brought it up, but I'm not even sure what that would look like, because it's, unless we have an in-house person who somehow is very familiar with the Sheriff's Department operations, and not just in theory, but on a sort of day-to-day or week-to-week basis. I don't know how we have a meaningful review of overtime, say, for example.
Councilman Nicholson.
I want to call it an administrative error. It appears on the packet we have this evening, and separate from and then comparing the proposed budget packet booklet. The GL at the top says that these are activities through 4:30, but in the booklet it does say activity through 6:30, which obviously can't be possible because it's not 6:30 yet. So, but they are identical. So I imagine 4:30 is the correct.
So yes, so
date that we got our numbers for.
4:30 is the correct
Okay.
update that your numbers are for. The reason why I would say 6:30 is at the time that it was run, which would have been 4:30, whoever ran it, and you can see the name of the user who ran it, would have run it, say, give me the information all the way through to the end of the year,
Sure.
which would be 6:30. But obviously, nothing beyond that date actually exists.
So my question is on account 445001, that's building additions and improvements for the sheriff's department. The budget has $500,000 in it. We've only spent $30,000. What are the have $470,000 worth of improvements been made already for the current fiscal year? Or are we waiting in the next 2 months to see nearly $500,000 of building improvements, or are we just waiting for the bill to come in, or what have we done on the building that cost $500,000?
So we have not, and that will ultimately end up needing to be rolled.
Okay. How does that? Curious in the process of that, when that happens and it's not in our current budget, is that an amendment that becomes before council? Now that the money, because I imagine the money, like we said last meeting, the money goes into the fund balance, but it is still in police, whatever this category is named in the fund balance. So we would have to pull that money out of fund balance and have it be for the GL once we have.
So that is
contract
correct,
established.
and the reason why it hasn't been reallocated right at this moment is there are a number of different projects that do need to be done, but none of them are actually scheduled as of yet. So even though we know we have projects and we know that there are things that need to be done, they're not scheduled. We don't know how much we're actually going to spend. So instead of doing another wild swinging guess, hey, we're going to spend $500,000. How about we actually know what we're going to do and we ask for that money?
So that was probably just a large number that was maybe misbudgeted in the past.
I won't even say misbudgeted. I will say it was a placeholder. It was a swing and a guess. Like, hey, we think that we can spend this much money in building improvements,
Because
but they
there
were
is a
never
substantial
scheduled.
project. Go for it, Mayor Kramer.
Yeah, I think it's even a little more than that, because I believe this was specifically for some specific tasks. You may already be aware of that, so I don't want to be redundant.
I'm not.
But there have been some specific needs at the sheriff's department that need to be done, and some of those may even start before the end of this fiscal year. So there have been specific projects that need to be done there. And unfortunately, I don't recall offhand, but I went through these with the city engineer while he was still here a couple months back now. And one of them was sort of minor. It was like blinds or something that really wasn't structural. But there was actually some water damage that occurred over at the sheriff's substation as a result of some sort of leak or plumbing problem. And as a result, there was actually some pretty serious substantive damage there that needed to be repaired. I don't know how this is accounted for with the fire budget that we'll be getting to, but there's also an issue with an underground tank that serves, I think, the fire station and or the sheriff's station, and that tank is not up to environmental snuff in terms of having two containment structures. And so that tank has needed to be drained and will need to be replaced. And so I think that's more probably in the fire budget, or it could even be in the capital improvements budget perhaps. But that's an example of things that do come up as we have an obligation to maintain these buildings that the city still owns, even though they're being utilized by the sheriff's department and the fire department.
So we should look forward in the future, if it doesn't happen before this fiscal year, for a request to pull money from general fund to fund those items, or bring money into this next year's budget.
Well, I don't.
There's nothing in this year's budget for building additions and improvements, so that's.
Well, there's my reading of the budget sheet here, and maybe I'm reading it incorrectly, but that there was $500,000 budgeted, and of that, $28,000 has been spent.
Last year.
The current year, right?
Yeah, currently, yes.
Yeah,
So we've got 2 months left.
Right. Okay.
But not in the next budget season.
I see what
0.
you're saying. When you said this year, I thought you meant the current.
Right, I'm sorry. Yeah,
Okay.
no, this next fiscal year, we're not. We would be looking. We would need to then have a. There would need to be a request to pull money from general fund if there are projects in the next fiscal year.
We may, but there are a couple issues here. One is that the cost of these projects was overestimated. So
Okay.
It's going to be a lot less than $500,000 based on my conversation with Mr. Siddiqui that I had a month or two ago. So that's one thing. The other thing is, I actually don't know. I had the impression that some of that work might have started on these. Now, maybe this is drawn out of a different fund. It could be out of the capital improvement fund, maybe. So I don't know. Mr. Carrington or Director Carrington, do you have some insight into this?
So the $500,000 is in the capital improvement fund. That there's a $500,000 that was allocated in Fund 445 out of the capital improvement fund. As the mayor indicated, there's a couple of things. One is a timing issue, as well as I think the cost projection from last year, and based on the guidance from DPW, is that those projects are not expected to cost $500,000. So what we're kind of potentially looking at is rolling over, the large amount of that $500,000, and then allocating it between the police and fire, because there are some capital needs for the fire department as well that we have not budgeted for out of general fund or for the current fiscal year, with the expectation that we knew that $500,000 was not going to be needed for the entire cost of the planned projects for police, and that there would be some money that could be reallocated, whether it's this fiscal year or next fiscal year.
Okay, so I'm sorry. I just continue to have a hard time with how the holes in how we are going to, what will come before us in the future. And I want to prepare us for those things that will come before the future. That way, it doesn't seem like it's a big surprise.
Sure. So
large ticket items like that.
So it could be one of two approaches. We can let that money go into the fund balance. If whatever doesn't get spent this year, we can let that go into the fund balance, and then we allocate it or via a budget amendment next year, or try and I'm not sure if we're going to have an exact number for this fiscal year, try and include it in what is ultimately approved by council. But so it can be one of those two approaches where we either attempt to put it into next fiscal year's budget that council will approve sometime next month, prospectively, or whatever doesn't get spent flows into the fund balance, and then next fiscal year we bring a budget amendment with specific information on those projects.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it. My thought process is, if we don't let it flow to the fund balance, reducing that number on the expense side. I mean, what I'm trying to also get my hands around is, at any given time when I'm asked by the public, what is the financial status of the city on an operating basis, and we've got a $500,000 expense that's only $30,000 is realized, yet that expense might get rolled over, dollars that are allocated toward it might get rolled over. When that happens at the end of the year, it's hard to have a very accurate answer to say this is where the operating budget is either negative or positive, when money flows out of the operating and into fund balance, but then is still there to come back in. It's difficult when we don't know the answers of the revenue that's budgeted to the expense that's coming. And I get that some of those things are always going to be up in the air, because we never really know what we're getting ourselves into when we open up a wall, or when we have some of these projects. But in this one, I mean, it's a big number. And for me, it's yeah, I mean, I guess that one would be something I'd be interested in getting more information about, just about what's been done so far, what we're waiting to have billed, and then
At the public
what
safety,
we might see.
At the Public Safety Subcommittee in March, a Sergeant Long, I want to say, but a sergeant shared that, or it could have been a lieutenant, that project was well underway, and that was March. So I don't know if that's been updated further.
Well, I've wondered that too, which is,
We don't have to speculate here. We could just put a.
yeah, we'll get information
Yeah.
for you. But I do wonder if the work's been done and the
This might be
invoices
when it
just
gets
haven't been
booked.
received yet and we haven't actually cut the check yet.
Yeah.
Which might explain why it's not budgeted for next year, because if we think we're going to get the invoice before the end of this fiscal year and or very early next fiscal year, like in July or August, it would still be attributed to this fiscal
Right,
year.
and I guess that the point I'm trying to get across with it, and it's the same as my last thing, is the fact that we still have that $500,000 listed as projected activity, to me means that we've not put a resource behind finding that answer yet. So we just sort of we kept it moving. We moved it, and that's okay if we don't have that. We haven't. I mean, we're not going to answer every single question and research every single thing right away. But I think it's the most prudent thing to do. It's just one of those things I like to point out to say, 500,000. That's good to know that that might not all be realized, and that maybe that 500,000 was a bigger number than what was actually required. Maybe not needed. Those are two different things. But 30,000 to 500,000, what's left, and then did that satisfy what the initial intent was, or what do we have waiting, and what should we prepare ourselves mentally for, and to have a succinct answer for the public when we have a budget amendment that says $300,000 for roofing, we want to pull from the general fund, and it's just sort of we can say, oh no, we knew about that. Prior council budgeted for that. The money went into fund balance, and now we're actually reallocating that to actually do the work. It's just in a different fiscal year. Those are. There's a narrative that I think is important to outline.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Councilman, number one. But number two, and more importantly, I think you're raising a really good point. And I know you and I have talked a little bit about it, but it's about adjusting these projected numbers as we go,
Right.
And making sure that as we, as the city and as the finance department gets more information, like, oh, we actually know what the costs of this project are now,
Yeah.
we should be adjusting the projected activity column accordingly.
Yeah, so for my colleagues that aren't in Finance Committee, I think to expound upon that, typically in forecasting, when that you're budgeting on an annual basis, and not every department makes sense to do this in, but specifically when there's projects like this, it makes a lot of sense. So you can say, okay, my bill came in and I budgeted that in February we were going to replace the roof. My bill came in and it was half as much as I thought it was. So what do? Do I then say I'm still planning to spend that money in my department and I can move it towards a future project in the year? So it's not necessarily changing your budget, but it's changing your plan. Where we're at right now, we have these big numbers that are in there, and it's up to us to remember why we put those numbers in there. And when things react, we can go through the detail, but sometimes that detail is really difficult to drill down into. So when we get the financial reports, there could be 3 pages of things with big long numbers and very short explanations, and it's really hard to parse through all of that. So as a business owner, is the way I like to think about a department director, for the conversations we've had in Finance Committee, is it would be really nice to be able to put that plan together, so that way every month they get their financials from the finance department as they do right now, but it's a really meaningful project because they take their financials and they plug it into a worksheet and are able to manage their business forward for the rest of the year. So we can realize and plan for the savings that we've got throughout the year, as well as the expenses that were unintended. So that's where this 500,000, we're hitting this point now, with only 2 months left to go in the fiscal year, and saying we're not really sure what we have or haven't spent. And we in this room can talk and can speculate about that, but the person who really knows that is the director of that business. So had we, if we can in future years, and we'll build towards that because it hasn't been an activity of the past, then we'd have that answer and that narrative would be drawn out for everyone. We'd be able to very easily say, well, about a quarter of the work's been done. We're not planning to do that, so we're going to reduce that budget number, or that forecasted number. We wouldn't probably go into the budget and deconstruct it, because that's just takes an act of government. But
Yeah, and Mr. Carrington, do you want to speak to your practice in terms of making those adjustments? Because I know as we went through reviewing the budget and preparing the budget, you had made some of those adjustments in some instances for some line items when it came to projected activity, but obviously not in all instances. So if you have any insight to share about your process and methodology,
Yeah.
that would be great.
And so when it comes to the projected activity, obviously we try and look at, to the extent possible, where we have, some level of cost certainty. If there's a consistent amount of cost that's being incurred on a monthly basis, if there's some type of lease or something like that, we're able to obviously track and project out those costs more easily. It becomes more challenging when we have a couple things that are in play. One is costs that vary. Sometimes things may vary based on the season or based on, obviously grass cutting is going to come at a different point in time than snow plowing. And then we also can't always estimate, how much snow we're going to need to plow, and working with the department. But then we also have a challenge in terms of our billing cycles, because sometimes if we get through half the year, if we're dealing with a normalized cost, we're able to, whether it's a third of the way through or half the way through, we're able to kind of project those out on a straight line basis. Where we run into some challenges, again, is when we have a delay in billing. Sometimes there may be a 30 or 60-day delay, and we're having to dig into that information and really get an idea of what's being billed, the timing of it. Sometimes, we may get a bill for this month that are costs from March or April. And those things aren't always processed on the same timeline. And so we try and go through there and based on the data and the information that we have, project out as best as we possibly can. It's just given, as many general ledger accounts that we have, as many vendors as we have, we aren't always able to get around and do the type of analysis that we have, that we would want to be able to do to get a great projection. And oftentimes it's not till we get towards the end of the fiscal year when we collect this information and we're able to really put together a more meaningful estimate of what we're looking at.
Thank you.
Councilwoman James?
Yes, Mr. Carrington, what was Fund 4454? What was that for? Do you know?
Fund 445?
Yes.
That's our capital improvement fund.
So that's all of the capital improvement projects?
So we try and put as many of the capital improvement projects in there. That's a non-general fund. It's funded through a millage. And so in order to kind of make sure that we're not dipping into general fund whenever and wherever possible, we utilize that capital improvement fund, which again it's a millage funded, millage financed fund, and we're able to tap that as a source of funding for capital improvement projects.
When does that expire?
I don't know that offhand.
Yeah, when you can find out when it expires and how much it generates per
Okay.
annum from the mill.
And the other question I have is who actually manages our capital improvement projects? Who follows them, tracks them, knows from inception, council has approved, this work to be done?
Yep.
Because it really is an issue with the city, the condition of City Hall, the condition of the police department. As President McGinnis said, there are some concerns. There's been a long history of neglect that we need to really begin to work on and do a better job of getting these improvements in. But, I'm wondering who does this? I mean, who's responsible for this?
Yeah, the answer is DPW and the city engineer.
It's DPW? Okay. So they have the list of capital improvements and they are actively
Yes.
working on those. So
Well,
then
well,
how does it
I want to
happen
be.
then?
I guess it depends what you mean by that. If you're talking about actual ongoing projects, they are tracking those, they are managing those. That's the answer to that. But if you're talking about projects at City Hall, there are no projects at City Hall. There have been many, many years, as you've noted, of deferred maintenance here at City Hall. And so there really aren't any capital improvement projects at City Hall, nor have there been in many years other than this council chamber in a long time. There is one exception to that, which is, as some of you who have been back there know, I have not been using the mayor's office since taking office, and that's because when on my first day upon arriving here, I learned that there had been a water leak there, there was mold there, and so there was a need to take away the wallpaper, replace the carpeting, and paint the walls, and that hasn't actually yet been done, although we anticipate it being done soon. So those are the only two projects, that and council chambers, actual projects, if you will, that have occurred at City Hall, I think, to my knowledge, and Ms. Sharp, you may have better insights than I do, but I'm not aware of any other capital improvement projects at City Hall in recent years.
So then I'm wondering, this projected $500,000, isn't this a projection based on actual work that previous council felt needed to be done? Actual work that was approved by the council?
You'd have to ask the previous city council or Ms. Sharp or Mr. Carrington.
So, to the
But I will just say, I think this 500,000, and this was more a question for you, Mr. Carrington. I think this 500,000 was set aside specifically for the sheriff's station.
It was.
For the sheriff's station, but
Yes.
were there specific projects
So,
that should have been done at the sheriff's station that someone could then have tracked? Because, I mean, I'm concerned that with Councilwoman Nicholson, that only $30,000 of a $500,000 fund was utilized. That tells, what that says to me is that somebody really was not executing our capital fund objectives. Did we have any capital fund objectives? And if so, why weren't they executed?
My understanding is, and I'll allow Mr. Carrington to speak to this, is that this is not a situation, and again, Ms. Sharp and Mr. Carrington, you have better insight into this than I do because I wasn't in elected office here in the city last year. But I don't think this is a situation where the city council said, we're budgeting this money and it's to do A, B, C, D, E, F, G at the sheriff's station, and only A, B, and C has happened. I think this is a situation where the previous administration proposed money to be set aside. I don't know how detailed they were in the reasons behind that or how many questions the previous council asked about the reasons behind that. But the specific projects were those projects that I've mentioned and that President McGinnis was told about during the March public safety meeting, and that there simply was a lot of money set aside in excess of those project costs in terms of the budgeted amount of $500,000 simply has exceeded the actual costs of those projects. But Mr. Carrington and Ms. Sharp, correct me if I'm wrong about that.
So I will only speak about the your question about projects. So yes, the previous council agreed to certain projects and amounts for those projects, but they did not happen. So the mayor is correct in that there have not been any capital improvement projects that have been executed upon. This chamber, pardon me?
For City Hall.
For City Hall. This chamber was not even, I wouldn't even call what has happened in here a major capital improvement. The mayor did some improvements, but it wasn't what it was supposed to be. This was supposed to, meaning the chambers was supposed to be done with the cable fund, those dollars. That didn't happen. So I will leave Mr. Carrington to speak to the police station because I'm not sure about that amount.
And I think Attorney Sharp and the mayor kind of touched upon it. And Councilwoman James, to I think your kind of core question, generally speaking, many of these capital improvement projects are, we provide kind of a general list of projects and estimates. Part of it is managing, because along with what DBW has been managing, in addition to this capital improvement fund, they're also managing the road funds. So I think part of it is just in terms of them being able to manage all of the overall projects that are, kind of before them, and being able to based on the resources that they have within the department, my expectation is that there's only so many projects that they can handle at one time. I know one of the things that was slated for this $500,000, I believe there was some issues and concerns with the heating and cooling unit at the sheriff's substation, and I know that the city engineer had been doing some work around that, and so I think a big part of it is just a timing in terms of getting these projects scoped out, getting an RFP prepared, and being able to issue bids. Not all of that I think was expected to be done in the first half of the year, and then things kind of get backed up in terms of some of the priority projects that the administration and departments are prioritizing in terms of the order of these projects.
I do want to Councilman James, and you'll have the floor. For the school district, when it was really before Pro Tem Carrington or I were on the school board, there was a facilities condition assessment conducted on all the buildings, and it was, a lot was spiraling out of control in terms of deferred maintenance, starved resources, cuts that had to be made. But once that was sort of stabilized and a lot of the vacant schools, the empty schools were sold off by the state requirement, a facilities condition assessment was very helpful for the school district prioritizing what are the absolute necessities, what are the needs, what are the wants, and to put that in a full comprehensive picture, we knew that $173 million was that price tag for that deferred maintenance for the 10 plus schools, administration building, facility, sort of the Fell Center, which is kind of like their facilities building. So that was helpful in terms of, okay, now that we know that, what strategic decisions do we need to make in terms of further school changes, school renovations, go for funding? Because it's an important question. We've identified that the capital improvements fund is a millage, and so that there is the prospect of taking specific needs to the people and saying, is this a priority for us? But that for us as city leaders, I'm not saying it's got to be done immediately because it is a big undertaking, and I think they contracted out with a firm to do it. But especially as we are further identifying what all our facilities are, and that there might be some changes to come with that, then what are our needs, and then how are we going to execute them? Some municipalities do have staff members that are kind of their point person to coordinate facilities improvements, to coordinate those capital projects. I'm not saying that's a necessity for us based on what our needs are, but it's a question we'll have to consider. Is the current capacity in Public Works or the engineer sufficient for, as we ramp up capital improvement projects, will we need more capacity to coordinate that? I mean, some bonds, when there's full bonds for a school district, et cetera, they sometimes hire a whole firm to be that sort of project manager, if you will. The Pontiac School District, they've been able to retain that in-house as a cost savings through Mr. Robert England. So that's his role with it. But it's to each organization, to each municipality, how that might be better handled. Mayor Greimel?
Yeah, I would add a couple of things. One is that certainly in terms of our in-house engineering capacity in recent years, it's been very, very limited. And as you're aware, one of the aspects to our budget proposal is to bring back in-house a number of engineer positions so that we can do more engineering work in-house and rely less on outside engineering companies. That will save money, maybe most importantly, or at least primarily, but it will also allow us to have more in-house engineering capability and capacity to do things like manage projects without having to hope that these outside contractors are doing that in a responsible way. And as we talked about earlier, having in-house people to manage things, and just whether it's going through a legal bill or whether it's actually making sure that we're getting the bang for the buck we're supposed to, is more reliable than relying on these outside contractors to do it. And so, to your point, Councilwoman James, and I think it's a good point, yes, we do want to make sure that we're doing a better job of tracking improvements, tracking repairs, and part of that is making sure that we're building more in-house engineering capacity, which is one of the reasons why we propose that in the budget, in addition to the cost savings it will generate. The other thing I want to emphasize is that my understanding is, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Carrington, is that the Capital Improvements Fund can legally be used for road improvements and has in fact legally been used for road improvements in the past. And so this is not just a fund that can be used for building repairs. It can be used for any capital improvements of any city-owned property, including parks, including roads. And so, there is a real trade-off to using these funds for city-owned buildings versus improving facilities, roads that are used by the general public, like parks, roads, first and foremost. So that's something to keep in mind when we start thinking about how to invest these funds in a way that most benefits the community.
Councilman James.
I understand, but I don't necessarily agree with you, because I think that the state of City Hall, the state of the police department are not representative of this city. They don't represent what residents really want for this city. We have a city hall that is beyond the point of just say, hey, it needs repair. It's an embarrassment. And let me speak for myself. I think that it is time for us to set priority where it needs to be. We have to update our buildings. I mean, we own homes, and we constantly work to update our homes and improve our homes because that's where we live. And this city hall represents all of the residents of Pontiac. And when was the last time that we've spent capital improvement dollars to make improvements and upgrades to this building? I think it's time that we prioritize it. I would like to do that. I would like to submit a resolution that we need to prioritize these buildings to bring them up to a standard where people will feel comfortable working in them. We're talking about bringing in new people. We want to increase our engineering capacity. I submit to you that we need to have the appropriate space to be able to bring these people to, because this building is not it. And if we want to be able to retain quality employees, we need to be thinking in terms of and really take seriously what needs to be done to bring this building up to a better standard.
Well, I'm not sure what you're disagreeing with, because all I said is there are real trade-offs involved, and there are real trade-offs involved. We only have a finite amount of money, and we have to decide how to spend that money. If we had infinite amounts of money, we'd have our streets paved in gold, and we'd have a brand new city hall. But we don't have infinite amounts of money, so there are trade-offs. I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't properly maintain the city hall, and there are, in fact, problems with deferring maintenance over and over again, because sometimes the cost can actually escalate and get worse over time if you postpone those investments.
That's right.
But I will just say that as we think about the priorities, like you and like I'm sure all of City Council, I've knocked on thousands and thousands of doors in this city over many years. And I've heard lots of people talk about investing in the roads. I've heard lots of people talk about investing in our parks. I can count on one hand at the most how many people I've heard talk about investing in City Hall. And so that doesn't mean it doesn't have to happen or need to happen, but it does mean that when we have a limited amount of money and we talk about prioritizing, we need to keep in mind what the residents really want and what affects most residents on an everyday basis. Every resident drives on the roads in this city every single day of their life. They don't come to City Hall every single day of their life. A lot of our residents would love to spend time in our parks at least every single week. They don't come to City Hall every single week. So I'm not saying we don't need to do it. I'm just saying that there are trade-offs. That's a fact. We only have a finite amount of money, and we have a lot of pressing needs in our community.
Councilman James made a very valid point in terms of looking at things comprehensively and for us to be able to plan strategically. And I think it's very fair for this council to say that we, as elected leaders on behalf of the citizens, see a great room for growth and improvement on strategic planning and having a full sense of what we're looking at. This conversation has been prompted by questions related to specifically the sheriff's substation. And for us to make priorities, we have to look at it holistically and comprehensively, which this intel doesn't allow us to do presently. Correct. For the sake of time, I do want us to keep going. Parker, Sharp, Nicholson. Parker.
Thank you, sir. I just have one question, and I know you guys probably can't answer this, but how much of our budget makes up the total budget for the sheriff's department?
When you say our budget,
Well, we're budgeting, if I look at this, there's 25,000.
right? So
So how
we
much of that makes up their entire budget?
we fund the sheriff's department. Well, not the sheriff's department. Oh, you mean
I
the
think-
entirety
yeah,
of the
I-
sheriff's department? I don't know
50?
that.
Is it 40? Is it 30? So that could be helpful for us to have overall a breakdown of, where the various departments, a pie chart.
If I'm understanding
Sheriff
that,
has a budget.
yes.
How much of our monies, how much does our money make up of their budget?
Yeah, I have no idea what the answer to that question is.
That might be something good for us
Yeah.
to know.
Okay. Ms. Sharp.
Just
Attorney
2
Sharp.
points really quick. So I provided you all with a handout, which was Schedule A of the contract, just to kind of give you an idea of how many sheriffs you have and the cost. So I thought that might be helpful. It's just some FYI information. And then the other point is just to Councilwoman James's point, that there was an assessment of this building done. So it has been done. And the previous council tried to allocate funds for different things. To the mayor's point, they couldn't do everything, just like windows. I think windows is like a couple of $1 million. Of course, they didn't think that was a priority. The parking lot, there was money allocated for the parking lot. So there has been an assessment done of this building. But again, with priorities, everything couldn't be done. Some things have been done, but nothing major. Thank you.
Councilman Nicholson.
On Schedule A, I wanted to point out something Councilman Parker brought up earlier about the question of benefit relief. There are two separate types of deputies as outlined here, with fill and no fill. And then the note at the bottom specifically states that with fill, they provide a substitute if the person is not there. Without fill, I don't have a definition of that on this page. So whatever paragraph 6.1 of the agreement says would be interesting for us to have as well, because I think that answers more of that question about benefit relief. I'm sure we have minimum manning, but minimum manning and what our contract we signed, I'm sure are two different things. So that's what I want to, if we could get that broader, I think it's still helpful to know 6.1.
But, Brother President,
Councilman Parker.
if I may, if I recall, one of the, I think it was over at one of the property subcommittee meetings, I thought the fire department presented a overview of the issues that was wrong with each building that they service. I think I remember seeing something in one of those subcommittee meetings
That is correct.
where the fire department had looked at the buildings and assessed it, at least from a fire department perspective, those things that was in need of repair.
That is correct.
That's what I want to say.
So.
Deputy Mayor Stevens.
So, if I may, we have spent a good deal of time on a very good topic, which is talking about capital improvement fund and budgeting. However, that was not the actual topic that we had prepared to discuss this evening. And so we can absolutely go more in depth on capital improvement on another night. I will say that we do have, as has been discussed, a list of items that we know need to be addressed throughout the municipality. Going back specifically to the item that sparked this conversation about the police substation and the needs there, and the fact that we had budgeted a certain amount of money but hadn't spent that money. And I had made the comment that those funds would be, either rolled over, which is not what is currently contemplated, but they would go back to the general fund, and then we would reallocate them. And the reasoning why I said that is going back to the idea that you want to look at the totality of what we have going on. So we know that the DPW department is not going to expend all of those funds in this fiscal year. We know that we have more capital needs than we have funding to address. We have spent the majority of our time trying to not focus on the physical needs of buildings beyond the fact of what is absolutely 100% needed in order to do our daily functions, and realign the departments and the personnel so that we can better deliver services. Therefore, we would come back to the idea of capital planning and be able to say, hey, these are all of our capital needs. This is where we are. These are the things that have to happen now, and these are the things that we can address over time. And so that's why it hasn't been deeply prepared for tonight, but we definitely can get more into that going forward. But that is why the answer was, hey, some of the work has been done. The work has been done that is absolutely critically necessary. An example of that is we did some sidewalk repair because it was a major health safety hazard right now. If that wasn't fixed, there were individuals who were at serious risk of trying to go to the substation and injure themselves. So that was an emergent issue that was addressed. So hopefully that adds a little bit more insight into how we got to where we are right now. But I would like to, if possible, continue to answer the actual questions about the direct police and fire budgets.
The one question I had was why $500,000 was a line item and $28,000 was spent. So we have thoroughly reviewed it, but that was the most glaring question I had. To Councilman Parker's question, I looked it up. It's $166.8 million is the Oakland County Sheriff portion of the county overall budget, this is, I think, slightly outdated, but for a recent fiscal year, so almost $1 billion for the overall Oakland County budget. $166 million is Oakland County Sheriff. So you could do some calculating in terms of where we slice. Any further discussion about police services that's represented through the Oakland County Sheriff's Department contract and related capital improvement fund?
I just want to point out we did review 6.1. It really only talks about what a deputy gets in their benefits and what an 80-hour work week means for an officer. So truly, I understand we're now in that contract. The previous council did sign off on that contract for 3 years as of December. But when you look at the cost difference, really the no-fill officer is $5,800, whereas a filled officer is $6,700. The filled officer position means when somebody is on vacation, they provide a fill-in. We don't have that. We have the no-fill option. So I could imagine that if we have a deputy that has had a tremendous amount of experience and which is great, and we would love that. However, they may have a higher accrual of paid time off. If they take that paid time off, there's not a fill. So I'm sure we're adhering. The contract does state minimum manning requirements. However, that doesn't mean, just for everyone's benefit, that whatever the amount of officers we have, 61 officers, doesn't mean 61 are working at all times or working within that 80-hour pay period. It may mean that whatever semblance of those people are off, they're off. I'm sure they do a great job in maintaining those those vacation times and keeping that to a good whole schedule. It's just, for the benefit of the question that was asked earlier, nothing in our contract shows that we do have those people, that number of FTE working in an 80-hour pay period.
Thank you. Other discussion on this particular budget review? Hearing no further discussion, we are now at fire safety or fire services. We contract with the Waterford Regional Fire Department. We have their chief with us. We have Mayor and Deputy Mayor. Any preface you'd like to offer?
So again, with this contract, the first thing that is to note is Waterford Regional Fire was very gracious in working with us and signing a shorter extension of their contract than what would have normally happened to give this council, this administration, time to review and look at what we were doing and to determine if we wanted to continue with Waterford Regional or if we were going to bring services back in-house. But if you look again, this should be a fairly straightforward concept, only from the standpoint of what are we doing as far as paying for fire services. And so this is a simple continuation of the contract which we have with them. And again, the concept of capital improvements that need to be done will be done first on a, hey, there are emergent issues. So one of the emergent issues that we are working on is the actual the underground storage tank. So that has to be addressed, immediately. But beyond that, there are other issues that we have noted, as Councilman Parker noted, that we have noted that we are actually researching to say, okay, what is that cost actually going to be, and what is the immediacy or necessity? How quickly must we address that issue before it becomes an issue that is actually causing real danger either to health and safety or to the building itself, because we have limited funds to spend on that.
Chief, would you like to give any context before we launch into further questions?
Good evening, Council and Mayor and Deputy Mayor. It's been great so far working with the Deputy Mayor. We've been able to meet several times, I email back and forth, I should say, a lot of times with information regarding some of I don't like the word neglect. We went through some rough times in this county, 2007, 2008 recession to Pontiac trying to come back and rebirth, and you see it happening every day. It's amazing what's going on in Pontiac. Waterford was in the same boat. So things got pushed off and pushed back because the dollars and cents weren't there. We were lucky enough to receive some state dollars to help fix some of the stations up to kind of bide us some time, but now we're at that critical point where we need to really start putting some dollars into the Pontiac residence buildings. I mean, these are important assets, and I think we have a good plan started. I think the idea of getting some outside people to look at these buildings is a great idea. I'm trying to get the same thing done in Waterford through the other 5 stations I have in Waterford, but I really look forward to working with the council and the mayor to improve these buildings and make them long-term assets for the city. I don't like deferred maintenance because, like the mayor had said earlier, the costs get much greater. And I'm going through that with one of my main stations right now in Waterford. I'm spending $60,000 on a HVAC unit that was not maintained properly, and now I have to replace it. It's silly money to spend.
Thank you. Councilman Nicholson.
My question is for the finance director. How are there credits, or what? How do we go from activity and then projected activity being a lower number? I haven't seen that yet. So in building maintenance, there's activity through 430 of 15,000, but the projected activity for the entire budget is only 10.
I'm sorry, what
That's
931?
yeah.
Okay. So sometimes there can be we can do some of the projections based on what's in the system at the time, because we're not always aware of what invoices are outstanding or payment. We generally look at whatever's been whatever has hit the actual financial statements. So from the time that we may come up with a projection, some actual activity can hit the account. So in this instance, there was probably an invoice or two.
The projection hasn't been updated for the
and
activity.
the projection didn't get
Okay.
updated from
Okay.
so the time that we made the projection back from I think this was back in early May. There would have been invoices that would have hit the account.
Okay. For that specific item, and we're talking about building upgrades of, we've got the one station we've been talking about, which has some shared space, but we've got other stations around the city. Whereas last year's budget was 40, this year is significantly lower at 5. Are there other dollars that we're looking at making those upgrades that the chief talked about, or is the 5 is just for routine? I mean, to me, that seems like we're going to paint a coat of paint.
No. So you would be correct. As we discussed, we have the capital improvement fund.
Coming from the outlay.
Right. So
Account?
it would be a combination of that and deciding how much of the general fund budget would need to be allocated to these resources in order to actually bring them to a stabilization point. One of the things that we have not specifically done yet is to say of the ARPA dollars that the city is going to be counting as lost revenue, where are they going to be allocated to, right? And so again, that goes back to the idea of saying we know we have a list of capital improvements that need to be done. We have not prioritized that list as of yet, and we have not prioritized that list as of yet beyond saying there are certain things on that list that we know have to be done right now.
Mm-hmm.
But beyond that, we haven't gone through it because we were focused on the HR side of things.
Thank you. So then capital outlay in 445, 976, which is just the police and sheriff. Am I right to then assume that that is, while the broader function is public safety, does that also share with police, with fire? So that $500,000 that we talked about, that would be the account that would be drawn from?
That would be correct.
Okay. So yeah, so maybe updating the name of that account so we can see that more broadly. Not just police/sheriff, but maybe police and fire.
Thank you. Others who wish to have the floor? Councilman Goodman.
And again, we're parsing through hairs of a millions of dollar contract. But I do want to ask the question about the difference between the activity for the utilities for electricity that's listed as 141 in here up until April 30th, and the projected.
Councilman, can you say that again? I missed it.
Yeah, so it is the utilities electricity line, which would be 101,336,921, and the difference between the activity so far of 141 versus the projected budget of over $4,000. I just want to understand. Yeah.
The South Boulevard Fire Station was browned out back when the emergency manager came in. When Pontiac and Waterford became one in the fire service. So that building was leased to the fire department at the time, and then the DPW here needed a really dire need to store some vehicles because there was really not a good location for that. So what we just kept, to keep it simple, all the utilities are in the fire department's name. So when we get the electrical bill, we send the electrical, I pay it first, and then we send the city for reimbursement. So I believe that's the electrical that you're seeing on there.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Other questions? Hearing no further questions and no further, Councilman James.
Just wondering if, is EMS a part of your budget?
In the city of Pontiac, we provide basic life support. We go on what's called high acuity calls. So anything serious like a heart attack, a shooting, a stroke, something that, like an example would be someone that an overdose, any type of serious medical call. But a typical slip and fall or a hurt knee, we do not respond to those. Star Ambulance handles that portion of it.
Okay, and they're not a part of your budget?
They're not a part of our budget, no, ma'am.
Any further discussion? Thank you very much, Chief, for your time. Thank you. We now move to the law. Mayor and Deputy Mayor, you have the floor.
So, as I think everyone on council knows, the primary attorney or the primary firm that the city is currently using is GMH, Gianmarco, Hollins, and Clark. I believe it's Clark. I just call them GMH. But so they are the primary firm that the city is currently using. But we do have a number of other firms that we also contract with for legal services. If you look at previous budgets, we schedule money for each individual law firm. What this budget does is does not assign money to a specific firm, but assigns money to specific functions. And we do that because we are looking at, one, rebidding the services out to look to see, can we find a better arrangement for our legal services in general. And two, the city is still contemplating the concept of, could we potentially bring legal services in-house, and what would that look like? I can tell you that one of the sticking points that we have is that even if we were to bring legal services in-house, there would still be a need for some outsourcing. It's just not feasible to have enough attorneys on staff to be able to cover all of the different areas of law that the municipality would need to cover. And so as we look at the idea of, if we bring in an in-house legal staff, exactly how many attorneys will we bring in? What would be those areas of specialty, and how much will we still need to outsource? So our first step is to rebid the service to see what is the actual new price that would be out there, and then use that number to benchmark against, all right, if we were to bring in-house attorneys, what are the going rate for those attorneys? How many of them will we need? And would we be able to provide better services at the same cost, or the same services at a lesser cost? And so that is why you have in front of you the current plan to continue to outsource legal billings, and this is what we are planning on spending. You will notice that there are 2 line items that have been budgeted out. Those line items related to medical marijuana, and through our discussions with the clerk, we believe that as of next fiscal year, we will not need those line items, that we will have completed the work that needs to be done specifically in those areas. And with that, questions?
Councilman Parker.
Well, I think you answered my question, but let me ask anyway. As you talked about that, it seems to me that there is some type of plan in place, or some thought in place, to bring in a director of legal services.
So exactly. So that is one of the things that we are going round and about. Do we take all of this money and continue to just bid it all out, or do we take a portion of this money and bring in an in-house attorney? And if we do bring in an in-house attorney, is it 1? Is it 2? Is it an in-house attorney and a paralegal? That is what we are still working through.
Okay. And because of that, will any of these other outlying legal services be on retainer for the duration?
So that is actually a great question. If everything stays exactly as is, we will continue to outsource all of our legal services, and we will not have an in-house staff or legal director. It is unlikely that that is the case. What is very likely to happen is, once we bid this out and once we get a good idea of what is the current cost of the amount of legal services that we are planning to take on, we will then be able to determine, all right, how do we manage that? And we will cut that cost down by bringing on an in-house person who would be the director of legal services, and cut back on some of the activities that we are outsourcing. But until we have a better idea of exactly, what firms are going to respond, what the hourly rates are going to be, we just thought it most prudent to continue with the setup that we currently have.
Councilman Goodman.
So if I can ask for clarification, what is legal services MTT, or what is in here as 101-266-804-022?
Prosecutions, code enforcement, lawsuits.
Tax tribunal?
Thank you. It's
Okay.
the taxes.
And the only reason I'm asking that is because of the rather large difference between the activity to date and the recommended budget for this year, as there is a difference between about $117,000. And I just wanted to ask for clarification for why that difference is there. or what causes it to be so large?
So I'm trying to find the item here, MTT. So I can't speak to why the amount budgeted was so large. We have not had much tax tribunal appeals, happily. And so I can say definitively that I'm not surprised that the amounts spent have been modest, because we really haven't had much going on currently, and in the past couple months at least, we've only had one active tax tribunal appeal going on. I can't speak to why the amount budgeted was so large, so I don't know if Mr. Carrington, if you want to speak to that, or I don't know if that was based on the previous mayor's recommendation, or if that was something that was adjusted by City Council. Perhaps was based on the previous year's experience, but Mr. Carrington, can you?
Yeah, I think by and large, with the recent growth in property values in the city, I think there was an expectation that there was going to potentially be some increased activity as it related to these types of appeals and these types of cases. Not that I'm trying to encourage that. I know this is being broadcast, but the activity, I think, just didn't meet the projection. Again, a lot of times when a community begins to see some appreciation, sometimes folks will respond negatively, and it ends up in appeals in these types of cases. And again, that was just the expectation, with the understanding that property values were going to be on the increase. We thought that there would be some increase in the work with the tax tribunal, and it just really hasn't happened. I think when you look at the Board of Appeals, I think the activity there has not been as great as one would have expected, going back 12, 18 months ago as well.
But to your point, Councilman, in terms of looking forward, you're right that it really, frankly, doesn't make any sense for us to have that large amount budgeted for the coming year.
Right.
And we've been focused really on the bottom line numbers, in part because the bulk of the vast majority of our legal expenses have been through the same firm. But there have been some exceptions to that, and so that's something that I do want to at least touch on as well as part of this, which is you're right that as we get into the specific line items here, we really should be reducing that Michigan Tax Tribunal line item. We do have some legal services that we've been accruing through the use of Miller Canfield, who was brought on by the previous mayor for specifically working with the pension fund and retiree health care issue. And that's because Gianmarco does not have an attorney with real expertise when it comes to the utilization of pension funds to cover retiree health care expenses. And as many of you know, the previous mayor and previous council settled a lawsuit that was brought by city retirees, former employees of the city, who brought a lawsuit way back 10 years ago when the emergency manager eliminated their retiree health care. And that lawsuit was settled back in 2017, 2018, and that envisioned utilizing pension funds. We're very unusual in that we have and have had a massively overfunded pension fund here in the city, utilizing excess funds there to fund retiree health care, where the city's liabilities far exceeded its actual funds for retiree health care. That's been quite a process, as all of you know, and it's continued into this year. And so as we've navigated the ins and outs of that, having this expert from Miller Canfield has been very, very helpful. In addition, there have been a couple of one-off matters where we have consulted with some additional attorneys. We have kept President McGinnis and President Pro Tem Carrington informed of those decisions, because we want to make sure that we're being transparent while respecting attorney-client confidences with the leadership of council. So I just wanted to make sure that everyone was aware that this total budget represents more than just Gianmarco, although Gianmarco is the vast, vast majority of the expenses this fiscal year.
Other questions on the law?
Well, so I guess I'll just point to the fact, because I think there was a lot in there. So I take it that the administration will be revisiting that specific line item to see if it can be reduced.
For MTT?
Yes, is the short answer. So,
Thank you.
I think to be forthright, we will, I personally and the deputy mayor will be more attentive to the individual specific line items here as opposed to the total aggregate legal amount. And as I look at this, it may make sense not just to reduce that line item, but potentially to increase another line item, for example. So we will be more attentive to the specific individual line items here. The other thing is, as the deputy mayor said, we're hoping to make a number of adjustments here ultimately, because we would like to see us bring in-house somebody to do some of the more routine matters. We believe that that could actually substantially save a lot of money for the city if we did that, one or more in-house people. So we are looking at a variety of options, and some of this obviously is contingent on getting out and selecting an outside counsel through an RFP process, which, because of other priorities, has taken a little bit of a back burner, but we are hoping finally to get that RFP out in the next week or so here, because it would be great to bring to council before the end of this fiscal year a proposed firm to retain, so that we have a better sense of what to expect in terms of the budget this coming year, so that the budget can be adjusted in time for the new fiscal year starting on July 1st.
Thank you.
Others who wish to be recognized on the law budget review? We are now at the executive's office budget. We don't anticipate that we'll exhaust the full nature of the conversation, but want to give the administration an opportunity to give us a sense of the changes that are proposed. Mr. Clerk, were there any requests for public comment for this evening? Understood. No requests for public comment.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Clerk. So, looking at the mayor's budget, yes, there are a number of changes that are reflected in this budget from last year's budget. The vast majority of those changes have actually been enacted during this current fiscal year that we are in, through acts of council, as we have created new positions such as the community concerns specialist. Did I get the right final name? Yes. So
I know that title was changed a few times there, but yes, you nailed it, I think, in terms of where we landed.
So you'll see that you'll see those changes reflected primarily in the salaries and wages, and all of the fringes that go along with salaries and wages. You will also see that there is an increase. There should be an increase in here. I believe it's under bindery services. No, it's under postage. So there is an increase in here under postage that you see. And that actually constitutes the concept that we would like to have a city newsletter that is going out, that will be jointly done between the executive office and the legislative office. So that is another marked increase that you will see change in difference. Let me see here. You will also see reflected here a large increase in training expenses. Again, we talked about the idea that for headcount reasons, whether the money is actually spent in this way, we have allocated a $4,000 allowance for training for every employee in the city. Some of that will be used, most of that will be used at the discretion of the employee and the employee supervisor. I actually had a conversation today with some employees who asked, is it possible that we can get trained on Microsoft Excel? Is it possible that we can get updated training on the BSNA system? So those are the types of things that have not been done in the past that we've allocated these fundings for. But there are other trainings that we are planning to do across the board, such as DEI and sensitivity training, such as customer service training, right? So the cost of bringing in those specialists to do that training will be pulled out of this fund, but the vast majority of these funds will be at the direction of the employees to move forward their ability to serve the city and just their ability to forward their careers. And with that, questions?
The insurance property coverage, can you share with me why that falls in the mayor's office and to what degree?
Oh, no, that's easy. That's an allocation. So when you look across, you'll see allocations of that across. And one of the things that we don't have, I don't think we have it tonight, but we were preparing a sheet of where all of the allocations go and the total. We did. Okay. Okay. So we will provide you a breakdown so you can see when you look across departments and you see all of these budgets, you'll see that they're all going to pay one aggregate bill, and we'll actually get you the breakdown. Well, not the breakdown. We will get you what that aggregate bill is, and these are the breakdowns of that bill that you're seeing.
Understood. Others that wish to have the floor. Councilman
Quick
Goodman.
question. I note that in copier lease, there doesn't seem to be anything in the mayor's budget in 22, 23 that I think, or maybe it has and I just didn't see it.
Say that again. Yeah. So we took all of the copiers and put them into the IT budget.
Okay. Oh, that answers that. Thank you.
Yes.
Councilman Goodman.
Just a couple quick ones. The one question I do have is the increase in travel expenses. That goes from about 4,000 to 10,000 for the mayor's recommended budget. I just want to inquire about that.
I'll have to double check that because generally speaking, travel expenses should be covered under training expenses, but that could go directly to the Mackinac Policy Conference, which the city needs to start attending.
And then the other one as well is the increase in costs for services / membership dues, which would be line 101-171-807.000, which goes from, I believe, close to 2,500 to 20,000.
Well, so that is correct, but if you go back to the actual budget that was suggested, it was almost 17,000. And the fact of the matter is that in this year, there were a number of organizations that the city should have been a part of that it was not a part of.
Okay. Can you give us an example if it's not proprietary?
Yeah, no, it's not proprietary. So we have MML. We've talked about, will we or will we not join SIMCOG? Another example of that, I am in the mayor's office, and so part of that is the International Economic Development Council. You also have a Parks and Rec program, not certification, but a Parks and Rec membership due that we need to pay. So there are just a number, and I will get you the breakdown of all of them, but there are a number of different professional organizations to which the city should be joining that we haven't. And we still may not join all of them, but the idea is that if we don't budget for it, it definitely won't happen.
Thank you.
Other discussion?
If I could, I
Yes,
think
Mayor
it's,
Frem.
I think those are really good questions. I was not aware actually that the travel budget had been increased, and I'm not sure what the rationale was behind that. So I don't know, Mr. Carrington, if you've got some insights into that. So that's an important question. It may, in fact, make sense for us to attend the Mackinac Policy Conference in the future. We debated about whether I should attend it this year, and I ultimately decided not to attend it this year. But it probably does make sense for us to attend in future years, especially if we can have a kind of an organized strategic approach to how to really utilize that time up there. You know, in my experiences in the past, I've been up there a number of years, and I think to really get much out of it, you need a real game plan, you need an organized schedule, you need to have meetings really filling the whole day. You know, just simply meandering around up there is not very constructive, I would say. And so I think, you know, there are ways to make it useful and worthwhile, but we didn't really think that we were going to have the staffing capacity to really organize it properly this year, which is why I opted not to attend this year. But I'm not sure what the rationale was to increasing the travel budget. Mr. Carrington, do you have any insight into that?
And while he's coming to the microphone, Attorney Sharp?
To let you guys know, you all are members of MML. I submit the PO for that, and I believe that the cost has been split between the executive and the council. But I
Thank
usually submit it for the entire amount. Thanks.
Thank you. Director Carrington?
Yeah, just in short, in response to the question about the travel, you know, it was really just to allow for funding for any increased costs associated with attendance of conferences and the like. I think it was an activity that the city had not been doing, particularly given the last couple years. Conference attendances have been down, and so we just wanted to make sure that there was funding provided for that specific activity.
And a brief question that you tell me if the answer is handy. For the Oakland University Initiative, $25,000 is sort of the going rate. Is that part of a binding agreement or just sort of the anticipated act of goodwill in terms of the broader Oakland University Initiative that the university itself contributes further, or it pays a prorated amount for somebody's compensation that does some work at the university? Do we know?
I'm not aware of any binding agreement that has been entered into, and this is actually an important conversation that we haven't yet had internally. What had happened in past years is that the previous administration and Oakland University had allocated funds, and those
Their
funds,
projects, or-
yeah, really, yes, sort of, it was termed scholarship awards, and these funds were allocated to specific entities in the community. And I don't think council, previously, council had any real role in allocating these funds. It was, you know, sort of this lump sum, and the previous mayor used this in consultation with Oakland University. Apparently there was some sort of actual joint decision making between the two of them, from what we can gather. And there were decisions made about allocating amounts that often were, you know, somewhere between 2,500 and 5,000 in total to different charitable entities, typically charitable entities. Although some of those funds were allocated to departments at Oakland University, and for each of those, generally speaking, half came from the city and half came from Oakland University. One exception to that is that the previous mayor, I believe, created a like a nonprofit entity called the Spirit of Pontiac Foundation, and she used the city's half of the allocation to provide funding to that, apparently. Oakland University, as far as I could determine, did not provide funding to that. So the previous mayor provided city funding to it, but Oakland University did not match that, from what I can gather in my conversations with Oakland University. I don't know that it really, you know, we put a placeholder in the budget for it based on what was allocated this year, but frankly, I'm not sure this really makes sense. And, you know, it's a conversation that I actually think we as council and mayor need to have, but also I need to get a better sense from Oakland University as to the rationale behind this. and I frankly haven't done that yet.
Understood.
But just in terms of some of the inquiries we've gotten since I've taken office about, oh, the previous mayor said that I would get X dollars and I never got X dollars, it's created some real headaches for us to try to figure out what was said previously, what wasn't said previously. We have not dispersed any funds, just so you're aware of that, since I've taken office, out of this line item because it's been very murky and because any commitments made in the past, in past fiscal years, well, within a month or two of the end of that fiscal year, any unallocated funds, and there were unallocated funds, just roll over into the general fund. And so, from my perspective, council hasn't authorized any allocations, and I'm not going to disperse funds unless it falls within some authorization from council, either the previous council for the current fiscal year or you for the coming fiscal year. So this is a very murky area, and
We shall revisit it.
yes, Mr. Carrington allocated the funds, but in terms of just kind of a placeholder, but I still need to figure out what do I even think makes sense moving forward, and I think this whole arrangement from past years was a little goofy, frankly. The other thing that I'll say is,
Will you?
I know we're out of time here, if that's your point, President. So forgive me if I may. I know there was a question about memberships, and I have not utilized any personal memberships, and I don't intend to otherwise. Just FYI. So I am a member of the State Bar of Michigan, but as I've done in past years, I intend to continue to pay for that out of my own personal pocket, not out of the city's pocket. So none of the allocation for memberships that we're talking about or that the council ends up allocating are going to be used for any personal memberships for me. I just want to be clear about that.
Thank you. We had no request for public comment. We stand adjourned at 6:00 p.m. The next session of the special meeting for the Pontiac City Council is tomorrow, Friday, May 20th, 3:00 p.m. We will make our immediate exit, so that way the Medical
Councilmember,
Marijuana
if you
Appeals
could
Commission
turn over